Well, you guys hit me with some heavy ones every now and then, some heavy questions. Um, Pedophilia. Someone is asking me. First of all, I'm not an expert on all these different things. Scott Kilby is not an expert on all things human. So when you hear me commenting on things, these are only things that I've encountered in my experience working with people. And most of the time, if I'm out here talking about it, it means I've encountered it a lot. So that I feel like I have some experience with it to share with you. So as I get these very widely varied questions, I just want you to know that that's not what I am. I'm not an expert on all things. If it has to do with human suffering, I probably know something about it. If it has to do with being free of human suffering, I probably know something about it. So the question here is, in so many words, is pedophilia an addiction? And I don't know the context of the person asking the question. I don't know if they are someone who has those proclivities, or maybe they know someone that does, or they're just curious. So I'm just going to answer it the best I can. This is a very sensitive topic, and there's not a lot of compassion for people who have these tendencies, obviously, because there's at least the chance that children can be harmed. Let me say this first before I talk about pedophilia. The psychological and emotional damage that I've seen done to people who are abused sexually is horrific. And I've had a bird's eye view, like a front row seat to this. For over 15 years, people have come to me as victims of child molestation when they were kids or young teenagers, either by someone they don't know, by someone they know within the family. It's incredibly devastating. It's incredibly devastating to the psyche. This kind of trauma leaves an imprint that is very, very strong in someone's psyche. It affects so many different areas of their life. Now, everybody's different, but some of the areas that are affected is just an inability to trust the people closest to them, people in authority, whatever. A deep sense sometimes of shame and even self blame. So, blaming themselves for it. And that's not just like a random novel thought that they have. There can sometimes be a deep strand of emotion, pain connected to the shame around it, a sense of being violated, and that the world isn't safe anymore. If someone had a deficiency story beginning to create itself as a child, you could imagine that an event like this would strengthen that, make them believe that they're utterly worthless or they don't matter. As far as we know, we think we're learning now through science because you've been watching my research. I want to talk about this, but I want to talk about the side of those who've been harmed by this before I talk about pedophilia and whether it's an addiction and whether we've been able to help people with that. We've definitely helped people with being on the receiving end of that kind of thing. Um, yes, the damage is of course you could say there's no self and no damage, but this is not something that you non-dual away. This is something that I've seen where people who are abused, for example, they get on a spiritual search later in life, quite frankly, like the rest of us, which is to escape the pain of this kind of trauma. And then lo and behold, what happens is they feel like they realize you can't escape it. So something happens. They're like on a meditation mat. They're in a retreat. They're just doing awareness practices, and suddenly the effects of this trauma begin to be in a way that you cannot ignore anymore. Unbearable, painful, scary. And again, science is even telling us that trauma and the emotional repression that results from it, and you can imagine repressing emotions when you're sexually abused, which I'll talk about in a second, how that then leads to physical illness, mental health issues. So the damage is truly remarkable. It's I've said this many times to my husband actually, that if people understood the damage that was done internally to the psyche of a person, um, when you molest someone, when you, without consent, put yourself on someone sexually, do something to someone sexually. I wish that, and I'm not being over dramatic at all. I wish that these sessions that I do with people, where they're bearing their soul as people who've been victimized in this way, if everyone could see what goes on in the mind and the body of someone who has been sexually assaulted or molested, you would never hurt a child again. You would never, never. And I'm not being preachy. This isn't preachy. It isn't about morals. This is about pain. And I think that's one of the issues is in the past we've always treated it kind of as a moral issue. And with that, we have condemned the pedophile, we have ostracized, we have imprisoned, we have castrated, done everything to the person who has a tendency to violate in this way. Now, some may say that those who have pedophilic tendencies may not have a conscience, and that's actually not true. Sometimes there is that sort of element of them where they don't have any remorse. But for the people that I've worked with who have a tendency to be attracted to children or even act out with children, um, well, first of all, I don't know whether it's an addiction to answer the question. Let me just tell you what I do see. Clearly see the damage on the side of those who are abused or molested. And I wanted to lead with that so you can understand. Again, if everybody could see the sessions that I've done with those who have been abused and molested, you would never harm a child. And some will say, well, again, does the person have the capacity to know that it's wrong? As far as I can tell, virtually every one of the folks that I work with have that capacity. And they do have conscientiousness. They do have compassion, but their drive outweighs or shuts down those aspects of their brain. And there's some science behind that. Just in the sense when you get a strong craving or a compulsion, it literally shuts down the part of your brain that would make rational decisions in that moment. So if you take someone who has a propensity to do this to a child, they may be able to cultivate compassion and understand rationally that it's not right to do that to a child and a real capacity of compassion and understanding. But then in the moment that the craving, which I want to talk about in a second, I don't like talking about it as a craving, but it's like a compulsion to be with a child. When that arises, it's like other addictions. And then it seems to shut down that part of their brain that has decided that it's not a good idea. Now imagine that. So I don't know whether it's an addiction is my answer, but it has of a lot of similarities to compulsion. So hear me out if you're someone out there with any interest in this, because this is a very not talked about part of this work. The things that I see in those who have an attraction to children is it's like a compulsion or addiction in the sense that when it comes up, it's very powerful. They don't feel like they necessarily have a choice when it gets really amped up, just like someone with porn addiction or any kind of addiction. So it's like that in that way. There's shame around it, as you can imagine. Working with some men with this proclivity, words like pervert or worse are sometimes strongly identified with. If you know anything about the new model in our work, you know that when you identify with these labels like pervert, deficiency story labels like pervert or not good enough, those things, they perpetuate cycles. You see, so by believing that they're perverts or whatever, it actually perpetuates the shame and the deficiency story. And those are drivers for their compulsion, just like with addiction. So the more they believe internally that they are a pervert, there's something deeply wrong with them, the more their body and mind just acts it out. They tell me this. Either acts it out through fantasy or, in some cases, actually doing it. It's so it has it's with everyone that I've worked with this, and there's been quite a few, frankly, because it's just something that I've been doing with people on the side, helping a lot of people who've been abused and a lot of people who've at least had thoughts of abusing. The ones that have had thoughts of abusing, they all, none of them were putting any children in immediate harm. If that would have happened, I wouldn't have worked with them or I would have reported them. These are people who were concerned. They all had the same drivers as I see with addiction. So they all had shame, and the shame would fester and create an identity of lying and secrecy and hiding, a lot like with addiction. And in that secret world of lying and hiding and porn, masturbation, they concoct a fantasy world. So part of the shaming that we're doing towards them is actually helping to create this sort of fortress of shame that acts as a driver for the compulsion, if you can imagine. And I'm not saying that we necessarily stop that. I don't think it's possible. We're not at the level of consciousness where we can stop the shaming yet. But so the shaming is going on, and if you don't understand what that's like to be on the receiving end, it seems like that's a good thing to do to people. And I guess maybe on some level it's therapeutic for somebody. But the problem with that again is when a society or a culture constantly shames an archetype, an individual, the individual has to go underground and become secretive and often concocting or creating their own private fantasy world, um, because it's not something they can talk about. They don't feel comfortable going to a therapist. Many people would say you don't even get the right to go to a therapist. So they're left to their own devices, literally, and they're being shamed for that. So without asking for help, then they live in that fantasy world, and that's in that fantasy world, that's where the potential for abuse really happens. Um, because in that fantasy world, they can dream and live out any fantasy, any aspect of the fantasy they want. And they never have to answer to anyone because everyone else is shaming them. So, from their point of view, there isn't anyone that they could trust anyway. So, they keep it to themselves. And that fantasy world, that shame drives the compulsion. Because when they do it, they feel even more shameful, like there's something wrong with them. And that confirms the identity and then creates more or strengthens the compulsion even further. It's a self-perpetuating cycle for sure. And it's not just that people have told me this. I've literally seen it inquiring with them that from the shame come the fantasies, come the behavior quite often, directly from the stories of the shame. The other driver that's similar to addiction is deficiency stories with all of them. And they have sometimes a little bit different flavor. Like, yes, they have the usual "I'm not good enough," but because of the way that the society looks at them, they might have some very deeply held specific stories like, "I'm a pervert," or "I'm the devil." And there would be people who would say, "Yes, you are." And I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying that gets internalized. And when they believe they're a pervert, you can see how that plays on. You would think that that would deter someone from then acting out with a child. Because if I'm a pervert, I don't want to act out as a pervert. It doesn't work that way. These deficiency stories drive the behavior. Because if you believe you are something, if you can do behavior that confirms it, unconsciously you're confirming the identity, which is exactly what ego identity wants to do. So, in feeding their deficiency stories and then them believing in them, driving, driving the compulsivity of this. I've seen it directly with people. I'm not saying change it. I'm just telling you what shows up. I don't know what the answers are. The answer is more deeper healing on both sides, but I don't know beyond that what the answer is. Um, and then trauma. So, not with every single one of them have I seen abuse, but there's been abuse in the history of many of them. So when they were a kid, someone introduced sex to them at an early age, and then that got wrapped up into their as an imprint in their consciousness. And so that plays into the compulsivity of acting out, replaying out that energetic pattern of what happened to them. So you have all these things that are the same drivers with addiction. And then one of the questions is this a sexual orientation? I get that question. I don't, I'm not going to answer that. I don't know. We have enough difficulty understanding sexual orientation when it applies to gay people, let alone this. Maybe someday we'll understand that. The point I'm making is that I've definitely worked with people who have a tendency to fantasize and want to act out with children. And just like with any addiction, when the compulsivity comes down, there feels like there's more of a choice. So, this is the takeaway here. And so, if you are someone who has this tendency, secretly get a hold of me if you want to help with the compulsivity. This is what I know I've helped with people with. I cannot, through inquiry, eradicate something that is a sexual desire for you. I can't eradicate the desire completely, or we can't together. If the desire is in some way hooked in deeply to a biological or something deeper than we can reach in inquiry. But what I have seen is, again, the compulsivity comes down by inquiring into the shame that the person feels, the deficiency stories that are with the behavior, and the trauma. And if there's emotional repression too, because just like with addiction, if repressing emotions, then that could be a driver for compulsive behavior. And then the other thing that helps to reduce the compulsivity in that is shadow work. Because often, but not always, someone who has this proclivity and that they long for or yearn for innocence because they've disowned that trait in themselves. Like that trait of innocence that children have. They may have that same trait, but with shadow work, we disown it and we repress it. And so we long for that, right? So these men, and sometimes women, that longing for innocence gets shadowed out on children very strongly. So, in addition to the deficiency stories and the trauma and the shame making that compulsive, there's a shadow element, which is actually a positive shadow. So, if it was a negative trait that these men were seeing in children, it would repel them because it's a positive trait that they've disowned, something that they're attracted to, innocence. When they see it in other children, it feels very pronounced because it's like any other shadow. So, they're essentially shadow hugging, going after their own shadow in the child and completely blind to it. And they don't have the tools, mostly ever do they have the tools. Never do they have the tools to re-own that shadow and stop projecting it out. And so they're just sort of forced to, in a lifetime of just going after the shadow. The compulsivity can come down when you do deep shadow work along with inquiry. So definitely through the years, people have reported to me that doing this kind of work takes the compulsivity down. And they've reported that not just with that tendency, but with other addictions and behaviors, like OCD, for example, similar emotionally driven behavior, fear driven, need for control. OCD is similar to addiction in that it has an emotional, psychological driver behind it, just like pedophilia. So, all people from all of those camps have reported that um, the energy behind the behavior, compulsion, reduces. And when that happens, there feels like there's more of a choice. So with those with addiction, they'll report that it's like I didn't have to do it. Like I could drink or not drink, especially if they're not in a cycle of drinking every day where there's withdrawals. Like if just every now and then they come back to drinking or before they came back to drinking, like that, they don't do it anymore. Those who have a strong compulsion to drink or had that in the future in the past, they start reporting either that they've decided to be abstinent and the work helps the abstinence happen, or if they drink or when they drink, it's much less and it doesn't feel compulsive and it's more like a choice. That's what we're seeing. If people go deep in inquiry around addiction, same is true with OCD. The behavior transforms because the fear and the control underneath it is reduced through inquiry. These things are brought into awareness and they dissolve, these drivers, over time. So then the person with the OCD then feels like they have more of a choice as the fear dials down, the compulsivity dials down, more of a choice not to engage in those behaviors. Same with pedophilia. So I cannot say that I can take away the desire for children with this work. It's not me doing it, the work. But definitely people have reported that they have not acted out because the compulsivity was dialed down in inquiry. And that's helpful for children. That's why I'm doing this video. Because if we can help any children not go through that, we will here in this work. I will. If anybody wants to come to me, either to help with the trauma of being abused or the proclivity to do it, let's do it. KillaBeCenter at gmail.com.